Ria, please start.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Good evening to each and everyone present here. Now, I would like to invite you on behalf of Dr. D.Y. Patil Law College to join us today on the auspicious day of 31st May, which is the celebration of the birth anniversary of the legendary Empress Ahilyabi Holkar. Today, we are all gathered here to not only celebrate the legendary anniversary, but we're also here to listen to a very important member talk about her experience, talk about her views and ideas. On 31st of May 2021, no, Abhiyanji stood out for her bravery and her judicious reign that had turned as an eternal inspiration to our society as she ran the contribution of women to our society. Now, if I may go ahead and introduce Mrs. Ujjwala Shinde ma'am, who is our principal.
Yes.
Ria, you are inviting me?
Yes, ma'am. I will give us brief introduction and then you may have the stage. Is that all right?
Yeah, it's okay.
All right. Now, to introduce Ujjwala Shinde ma'am, I must begin by stating that she is a woman of inspiration. The characteristics ma'am possesses is that of kindness, optimism, and motivation.
Ria, little brief, because it's Aishwarya ma'am sure. It's not mine. Okay.
No worries, no worries. Ujjwala ma'am has completed her PhD guide in law at Savitribai Pune University. She has been appointed as the Vice President of University of Women's Association, Savitribai Phule Pune University, while also being appointed as a mediator with the High Court of Bombay. Ujjwala Shinde ma'am has also published not just one but two books on alternative dispute resolution. Ma'am, we welcome you to the stage.
Thank you very much, Ria. Now, I'm here to welcome. Good evening, all. On behalf of Dr. D.Y. Patil Unitech Society's management and Dr. D.Y. Patil Law College and my own self, I welcome our today's guest, Additional Solicitor General of India, Advocate Aishwarya Bhatti ma'am. I also welcome all the faculty members of the Law College and all the enthusiastic participants. At the outset, I am thankful to Aishwarya ma'am that in spite of her busy schedule, she has managed to take out some time to address the gathering. I also acknowledge the efforts made by Team India members. I am thankful to them, specifically Pranay Singh, Rohit and Subodh Sahasrabudhe for helping to organize this event. I appreciate the efforts made by the college organizing team, Assistant Professor Madhavi More, librarian Ajay Kavle sir, then coordinating students, Ria, and all the faculty members. Today's topic is ever-burning topic, Constitution and women empowerment. One might say that, why always women empowerment? It is so old topic, itna घिसा पीटा topic hai, always women empowerment, women empowerment. But friends, women are always facing new challenges and always new empowerment is required. Though Constitution confers fundamental right of equality, still there is gender discrimination. The interpretation of empowerment is always changing with time. I would like to say that I always feel women should be strong enough from within, that she will not require any crutch or any outer help. Power and to make choice go together. To discuss this, we have today the right person to share her views on the topic. I'll not take much of your time as we are eager to hear you, ma'am. Last but not the least, I'm grateful to management of Unitech Society, Dr. P.D. Patil sir and Dr. Somnath Patil sir for their wholehearted support and giving us opportunity to organize such events. I again welcome you all. Thank you very much. Dia?
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now, moving along in this event, we have Subodh Sastra Buddhe, who will be talking to us about Think India. So, if you may go ahead and present your views, we are all here to listen.
Yeah, thank you, Ria, for having me. Yeah. So basically, all the students are eager to know about what Think India is. So Think India is a national forum of students, alumni, and faculties from several premier institutes with different academic backgrounds, such as there are from law backgrounds, management backgrounds, and as well as science backgrounds. Think India was initiated in 2006 by the students of IISc, IIMs, and NLUs at Bangalore, India. And the first convention was happened at Sri Sri Ashram at Bangalore. And in this Think India, we felt that it is a need to bind the students with an Indian nationalistic string to harness this part of national treasure in furthering our aim of national reconstruction. So, Think India is an initiative to bring the best talent from all over the India and generate ideas and views to gear up the national progress. We run various internship programs such as Niti, Vidhi, Anubhuti, Samvad, and Samsadiya. And also we have different forums working under Think India, such as International Relations Forum, Governance Forum, Human Rights, and Economic Forum. So today we are very grateful to have Aishwarya ma'am on our platform, and also I'm sure it will be a great intellectual treat for all the listeners and especially for the students. We are relatively a new chapter working past from 1 year. Thank you, Aishwarya ma'am, for giving us this opportunity to host you. And over to you, Ria.
Thank you so much, sir, for giving us your insight and for explaining to us what Think India is all about. Moving on to the next part of the event, the most awaited part of the event, the introduction of today's speaker for today's event, Aishwarya ma'am. Now, Aishwarya ma'am has been a trailblazer litigator. She is the youngest woman advocate to be designated as the senior advocate by the Supreme Court of India. She also has a distinction of being one of the youngest additional Solicitor General of India and the fourth woman to ever occupy this coveted position ever. Aishwarya ma'am has also passionately fought for women's rights, children's rights, rights of persons with disability, and also been a crusader advocate for anti tobacco litigation. She has led from the front the rights of women officers of the Indian Air Force, Indian Army, and Indian Navy for at par consideration for permanent commission and command positions. She has been instrumental in leading the battle against the mighty tobacco industry on issues of larger pictorial warning, plain packaging, and stronger tobacco regulation. Thank you for joining us, ma'am. We are all here to listen to your words. You can have the stage, please.
Thank you so very much, Ria, for those very kind and generous introduction. My warm greetings to all of you. My warm pranams to the principal ma'am, the illustrious principal ma'am, who's the beacon for guidance for important positive initiatives during these important times. I'm very familiar with the work of Think India across the country because I have been closely associated with the platform. I have interacted with the students. I have had many interns in my office, interacted with them. They've learned from me, I've learned from them. And I feel that the platform is doing, doing a phenomenal job of really ensuring that the positive interactions continue in the student fraternity and especially in the fraternity of students of law. So splendid job, and double congratulations for doing it in this difficult time where all of us, the whole country is dealing with personal misery and agony and sufferings. And in this time, if we can take out the time to do some positive occupation of our time, positive interaction as students of law. I think that deserves a congratulations. So congratulations to the whole team behind this, and of course, Principal Ma'am, under whose guidance this is happening. So we are going to keep this interactive, like I requested Madhvi Ma'am also, that I don't want it to be a one-way session. This is not a topic that we want to do in a manner that is just a monologue on one side or a lecture on one side. We will make it interactive. I will try and introduce the topic with some of the thoughts and take you through the journey a little. When we talk about the Indian Constitution and how Indian Constitution has been really a pole bearer for gender justice, we have to start the journey from the birth of the Constitution itself. So I will have to take you some 74 years back when we got independence. I mean, you were all very young, and I myself was not there at that time, but just take you, let's think about time travel, and let's try and transform ourselves in a world of the 1940s, that mid 1940s. We are talking about the world that was, where colonialism and, discovery was at a different pace. Democracy was taking nascent steps, despite world's oldest democracy being there as a democracy for about 230 plus years, the US. Still, democracy was taking nascent steps in other parts of the world, and there were different kinds of governance and systems which are prevalent now also. One thing I definitely want to I like to give, for the purpose of perspective, I give this example a lot, so I'm going to start with that example. That example is of the 19th Amendment of the US Constitution. Now, just last year, this 19th Amendment, can I be heard? Can I request everyone to please mute your mics?
Ma'am, you are muted.
Sorry. Could you not hear me from the beginning? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
yes, we could hear you.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, sorry, I muted myself in between, is it? Sorry, I apologize. So I don't know how much I was heard, but I wanted to give you an example to take you back in time travel to the time that, the Indian Constitution, the journey of Indian Constitution started when we got independence, and the Constituent Assembly was framed to make the Constitution. Just to give you a perspective, the example that I want to give you is the 19th Constitutional Amendment of the US Constitution. Now, US Constitution is supposed to be a sterling example of a democracy, which is one of the oldest democracies of the world. And, for the purpose of really landmark, you look back at the US Constitution and its interpretation in a lot many manners. US Constitution, in the 19th Constitution Amendment, which the 100 years of which was celebrated last year, they gave franchise to women. Now, it is interesting to note that a nation that has been a democracy for 230 plus years decided to give right to vote to the women of the country only 100 years back. So before 100 years, there was really no, it was like emasculation, political emasculation of women in that democracy. There was no right to vote, and right to vote, today we may not appreciate the importance or the profoundness of that right so much, because it's now freely available to all. But the right to vote is a very important right for not just, it emasculates you completely in a political sense, but because you are not a voter, therefore you are not in the mind of policymakers, of governance, of legislature. So it actually results in complete strangulation of civil, social, economical rights in all manners for that group that is emasculated politically. That's how it is. Now, interestingly, while the 19th Amendment has celebrated 100 years, which means about 30 years prior to our constitution. It is interesting to note that 19th Amendment in the US is a very strong federal nation. We all know how states have a lot more latitude and liberty to have its laws. So in US, 19th Amendment did not give all women right of franchise altogether 100 years back. Some states, so it started, states started giving right of voting to different, to women in their state-wise. And it took the next 50, 60 years for all women to actually realize their right of voting in the US. So it correlates with that period. I mean, it started 100 years back, the amendment, and then for 50, 60 years, it took different states to, the last state actually took 50 years plus to allow franchise to women. One more point of reference, Switzerland, we all know Switzerland. I mean, it's a respected country in Europe. Switzerland gave women the right to vote in 1971. I am talking about 1947, and Switzerland gives it the right to, I mean, I'm not even taking you to Saudi Arabia where women did not even have right of, by right to vote came sometimes is a far cry. The right to drive a car itself was something that they have struggled with and just got 2-3 years back after a lot of long persistent movement. So I'm not even giving you an example, but some reference points contextually give us a better understanding, I feel. So while the world was going through this, rights of women, and this is just political rights, okay, if you would have read as students of law, the jurisprudence behind the crimes against women, rape was not even considered as a crime against women, because women were considered to not have any right of self-determination. So rape was considered as the highest form of crime against the property. Now I'm taking you to 200 years back. Okay, I'm taking you a little back, but just to give you that reference point. So rape started off as an offense against the father if the woman was unmarried, because she was considered as father's property. And rape was considered as a crime against the husband if she was married, because then she was considered as husband's property. Now, last of this relic, we ourselves have gotten rid of just 2 years back when we knocked off that provision of adultery from our IPC, and by a very interesting judgment, the Supreme Court held that there's no space for adultery to be there. I'll come back to adultery. Adultery makes for a very interesting analysis against study point again. But 1947, the constitution makers, the Constituent Assembly starts to make the Indian Constitution. It's loosely known, referred to also as a bag of borrowings. But essentially, it is really it's condensation of the best practices of the world. Our founding fathers had the foresight and the wisdom to frame our constitution in a manner so as to allow rights to be available in different silos, so as to allow a strong foundation to start with. So we have never had any problem of universal adult franchise, because right from the day go, right from the beginning of our journey as a young democratic republic country, constitutional republic country, we have had adult franchise and universal adult franchise. Women have had equality. In fact, our sense of equality, the manner in which it is enshrined and understood under Articles 14, 15, 16, it is very important to note that our concept of equality is equal treatment of equals. In fact, our form of equality is actually more progressive because it keeps room for affirmative action. So it does not mindlessly, put everyone in same silos that, oh, you all have to be treated equally. No, it recognizes the fact that because of the reason of various reasons of, historical baggage, because the manner in which women, children, the vulnerable position that they are in, because of historical inequalities to SC, ST groups, etc., they needed to have special attention of the state, and therefore there was requirement, there was almost like a affirmative mandate on state to have progressive laws for the purpose of making sure that women, children, and these marginalized groups who are otherwise, who suffered for centuries altogether, they were brought on a same pedestal. So then when you bring them on the same pedestal, then you are treating about, then you talk about equal treatment of equals by bringing them on equal pedestal. Part 3 rights, the manner in which they are interpreted. I will come to the functioning of the Constitution when I speak about some of the judgments that have interpreted the Constitution, but I'm right now on the letter of the Constitution. So part 3 rights, and then very, very significant is part 4. Now, part 4 is not rights. We all know part 4 is the directive principles of state policy. Now, this is a very interesting chapter that was included in our Constitution. And this chapter has actually paved way for maximum amount of statutory protection, policy intervention for the purpose of ensuring equal protection of laws in true sense. So there were a lot of things. For example, if you look at the part 4 rights, there are very significant rights that have been given there in part 4 for women. And our founding fathers were aware that as a young democratic republic who was coming out of 250 years of colonial rule, we did not have the wherewithal to really have, have those rights as enforceable rights. But they were very circumspect in providing that direction, that this is the direction in which the state should ensure that its laws and its policies are directed. And some of the examples there are very, very important because they have now fructified. Today, what it is fructified is actually from those directive principles. So, to give you some examples, equal pay for equal work. We have a law that protects it, but it was not a part 3 constitutional right to start with. Of course, now with the interpretations given to Article 14 and Article 21, it has been read into it. But equal pay for equal work, equal living wages, maternity benefits and relief is a huge chapter and a huge area which actually allows women to be equal partners in the workforce, to actually go out and have an identity of herself, to make a livelihood or a professional identity for herself. I think this is a very significant aspect of the law that has developed from allowing maternity benefits and leaves and childcare leaves, etc., to the recent developments that we have seen for the last 10 years, where creches have become mandatory for all establishments, whichever establishments are having women as part of their workforce. It is mandatory for those establishments to have creches and childcare facilities available. This I am particularly focused on this also because in Supreme Court, the creche first time opened when I was the secretary of the Supreme Court Bar Association. Chief Justice Dattu had opened the creche. We did not have good facility. There was no area earmarked. And actually 2 chambers were taken up and it was converted into a creche. And this crusade had taken so long because, thankfully, you are all young students, so you will probably not realize the importance of it. But there comes a time in your career where you have to, as a professional or as a working woman, it almost like a choice is inflicted on you, that whether you want to be a mother or you want to continue to be a professional or you want to continue to have your job. Now, no mother wants this choice. This is a choice that is wrongly inflicted on working women. And how can she fight that choice if there is no infrastructure, or how can she really, I almost gave up my profession. When I was a young mother, I became a mother very early and I almost gave up my profession. I felt that I did not have the strength and the wherewithal to take care of my children and have a professional, standing both together. And it took almost like a eye-opening, waking up call from my mother. And she said, well, thankfully we have, that is why women like Maharani Ahilya Bhai Holkar are important, even in today's time. Because when I was struggling with this thought whether I should continue with my profession or not, my mother told me, if Jhansi ki Rani Lakshmi Bai could go to the war with her child tied behind her back, why can't you do a profession with your children? It is not, I mean, it will be difficult, but go and do it. So those are examples, which actually give us inspiration to go on in our life and, in difficult periods to pick up ourselves and carry on with strength. But I must say that having the creche in workplaces is one very strong, very strong and empowering benefit for allowing women to continue in workforce without having the guilt of not being able to take care of their children. So you'll realize it later, but I feel strongly about it, so I'll highlight it a little. But so these rights, maternity rights, etc., from Part 4 of the Constitution, they have now fructified into very strong, robust laws. I mean, recently, not really recently, but some time back, we had to do a case of a dental doctor who was employed in one of the Delhi hospitals on a contract basis, and she was not given the benefit of maternity leave on the pretext that she was a contractual worker. Thankfully, now the functioning of our constitution has become so seamless that you don't have to bat an eyelid. But I mean, it's still strange that you still need to knock the courts of law for getting justice on these points and pretexts. I mean, just because she's a contractual worker, it's not like you can deny her the benefit of maternity benefit, which is available to her statutorily. But these are problems. Now coming to the working of the constitution. So the one part of my thoughts is really about how the constitution, the constitutional principles and the constitutional ethos allowed a sound framework for us to build our strengths. Anyways, our value system was such that our value system had to take it in this manner. Thankfully, our founding fathers did not look at the West too much in these areas of women's empowerment, and allowed flourishing of women. Now, some of the Part 3, some of the affirmative action that has taken place in terms of the special protection that is provided in the Constitution by way of affirmative action. So if we speak about the laws with regard to, let's look at criminal law, dowry laws, or after Nirbhaya, there are laws with regard to stalking, voyeurism, acid throwing. All of these laws have been possible because there is the mandate of the Constitution to assure dignity of women in a manner that is commensurate with the rule of law. Another very important example is the judgment of Vishakha. Now, Vishakha's judgment in 1996 is the judgment that actually laid the foundation for the sexual harassment law. Of course, the law only came in 2013. But the Supreme Court in 96 judgment said that these guidelines that we are framing is going to be the guiding guidelines, and they will have the force of the rule of law till a law is framed by the parliament for curbing sexual harassment of women at workplace. So it was important for this entire legal regime to really be built and be in place. I can take you now. I would like to slowly, in a short manner, touch upon the journey of the interpretation of Constitution with the eye of, with the spectrum and the prism of women's empowerment and gender justice. Not really women's empowerment. We need to empower ourselves. The society needs to empower the women of the society. One half of the population cannot live in the fear of safety, security, in the fear of not having the potential to realize their full aptitude and to contribute in equal measure as one half of the population. It's not just about getting, it's about contributing to the family, contributing to the family of the nation, family of humanity, family of society. So the working of the Constitution is a small journey that I want to give by picking up 5 or 6 cases from that different decades. The first decade of the Constitution saw cases where, the kind of litigation on women dignity that came was, one example was that a rule was there in the central government, which required that if women employees, if women have to get married, then they have to take permission of their superiors before getting married. This is a central government rule in the 1950s. And no such rule is available for the gentlemen. So this gets challenged. And of course, Supreme Court strikes it down, but in very measured words, they strike it down. And see, I'll give you one example from every decade, one or two examples, otherwise it will become a discourse on judgments only. But see how the journey goes. I am wanting to take you through this journey of time travel of the interpretation of the Constitution. The next decade saw one of the important judgments on this issue came in Nargesh Mirza versus Air India, where the Air India had this policy that for air hostesses, they are not going to allow, women who have children and who, if they decide to get married and decide to have children, then they cannot continue employment with Air India. Now, interestingly, here also the observations are somewhat in a manner that, okay, there can be, the discrimination between men and women depending on the kind of duties that they are doing, etc. But you can't allow this kind of a discriminatory practice to go on, and it was struck down. Now, one example I want to give you of one issue, I told you I'll come back to adultery. Adultery is very interesting because adultery got challenged in the courts starting from 1950s. So adultery as a section, now just to remind you what adultery was before it was struck down by the Supreme Court, the section of adultery in the IPC is not how adultery is generally understood in English and in matrimonial law. The definition of adultery to be an offense in IPC, of course, our IPC is Macaulay era law. It is a relic of the past. In keeping with that framework, the definition was that if a man has sexual relations with another man's wife without the consent or connivance of her husband, then he is guilty of adultery. So if a man was to have sexual relations with another man's wife with his consent and connivance, then it was not an adultery, and it was considered as an offense against the husband. And woman was she was treated as a victim of this crime. So this first got challenged in the decade of 1950s in the Bombay High Court. Now, Bombay High Court is one of the chartered high courts. It has always commanded that respect. So they went into this issue threadbare. They said there's nothing wrong with it. Adultery got challenged again in two subsequent occasions before the Supreme Court. And you'll find it interesting that of course, I'm sure you all know of the judgment 3 or 4 years back, when adultery has been struck down by a unanimous judgment of a constitution bench. One of the important fountainheads of that judgment is Justice D.Y. Chandrachud. But the senior Chandrachud, who was the author in one of the earlier round of judgments where adultery was challenged, they said they found nothing wrong in adultery. So it was challenged on multiple, occasions, sometimes saying that woman has to be treated as an abettor, or it has to be equally available as why only a husband is taken as a victim of the crime and he alone can, it's taken as a crime against him. So on multiple occasions, on multiple sides, it was challenged, and the Supreme Court found nothing wrong with it. But in the decade of 20s, just before, this judgment is around 2017-18. So this judgment comes, and now the Supreme Court, by a unanimous judgment, Constitution bench, says that this is an affront to women's right of dignity, and there can be no place for this. Now, see, I'm talking about a topic of law, of an issue of law, which did not undergo any amendment. It has continued in the IPC since 1860. 3 occasions, the courts did not find anything wrong in it. But now this is surprising. How does this happen? That, earlier you did not find anything wrong in it, and now you find that it is completely unconstitutional. This is the very intriguing and interesting aspect of constitutional interpretation, which as students of law, I think it fascinates me a lot, and I'm sure it will fascinate all of you a lot. This is the aspect of progressive interpretation of constitutions. Thankfully in our constitution, our interpretation principles are so crystal clear that interpretation of constitution always has to be in terms of the times that we are in. One of my favorite lines in a constitution bench judgment is that fundamental rights are like empty vessels, and every generation has to fill those empty vessels with its own wisdom. That is why you see the same right, the same provision of law gets interpreted in different manners across different decades, and it is understood in a progressive manner. Now, here also, thankfully, we don't have the American system where one set of judges are purists. So they like to find out what the constitution framers had thought of when they framed the constitution 230 years back. So they interpret law in that purist fashion. But in our constitutional interpretation principles, we have no scope for this purist interpretation, at least in constitutional interpretations, and it has to be interpreted in keeping with the time. Our constitution is considered as a dynamic document. It's not a dead letter of law. It is an organic, dynamic document that goes on with life. So that is one aspect, and that has allowed even another provision of law of this time. Now, 2018 saw some very interesting judgments with regard to dignity of women. And one such judgment was banning the practice of triple talaq as an unconstitutional practice. Now, this is also a very interesting journey, because through the decades, the Supreme Court dealt with these issues on multiple occasions. We still have a serious problem despite Article 44 mandating uniform civil code. We have a serious problem still in our country, because our marriage and divorce laws, marriage, divorce, and succession, these 3 laws are not religion neutral and are not gender neutral. The problem is that these 3 aspects, which are very important for women to, men and women all, but women specifically, to really grow in families, in their societies, and to really shine in the domestic atmosphere. Today also, when we see all the women have today broken all barriers. They are in fields that hitherto were not known to women. There's no field that is untouched by women. No, there are no male bastions anymore. There are no white collar or blue collared clubs which do not allow women. It's their merit that determines. But the difficulty is that at home, in the society, we still need a long gap to fill up. Our constitutional principles provide that robust mechanism, but still, if at home we do not treat our sons and daughters in an equal manner, in an equitable manner, in an affirmative equality manner, then we are not going to have women who will have significant contribution in the manner that they are capable of to the society. One such recent example is a judgment that I had the privilege of contesting. That was women in uniform, women in the defense forces, women in Indian Air Force, Indian Navy, and the Indian Army. Now, these women had been fighting a battle for permanent commission, at par permanent commission with gentlemen officers. And it was, I'm sure you all must have followed that judgment. That judgment made huge headlines 2 years back in March. It was, 2 years back, no, last year only. Last year, February, we got the judgment of Army. And in March, we got the judgment of Navy. The Air Force case is still pending, but the Army and the Navy judgments are absolute landmark and water through judgments, because they have become such strong pillars. And it is important to note that even in this time, I mean, you would have thought that women did not, the issue of women's empowerment is redundant. but the kind of reasoning that was given in the arguments in the army judgment to deny women command roles and at par consideration for permanent commission, the kind of excuses that were given was they have lesser physical strength, they have matrimonial duties, they have domestic duties, they have biological duties. If they are taken hostage by the enemy, then the nation will not be able to take, the infrastructure is not there. This is going to disturb. Another example was that this is going to disturb the social fabric of the army, because the soldiers that are there, they come from that social strata that they can't take command from women. That was the kind of arguments that was given. Thankfully, those arguments were completely demolished, rubbished by the Supreme Court. And in a very emphatic judgment, which is a celebration for, again, equal opportunity and equal right for women across all fields, not just for women in uniform. The very emphatic terms, the Supreme Court has said that that there was no space for these stereotypical mindset notions neither in our constitutional sphere, not in the sphere. And they said that the mindset has to change. This is not a problem. And actually, the problem is not really of anything else, but of mindset. It is the stereotypical mindset. It is the patriarchal mindset that remains the problem. And we will continue to have to fight this battle till this mindset is not knocked out completely. And trust me, this is not a battle that we are fighting in India alone. This is a battle. Women's journeys are issues which are, the more you scratch and the more you realize across geographies, across governments, across timelines, there is an uncanny resemblance to these issues. And you realize it that when you're dealing with issues, I mean, the right of self-determination, right of abortion, of access to a free, to a safe medical termination of pregnancy is a right that women are in European countries are still battling for. And that is another issue. I mean, I'm not even going to take you there. I've far exceeded my time. I thought I'll keep it to 30 minutes and then we'll have it interactive. But okay, so this is what I have broadly laid it out to you. I think let's start the interaction so we can take this discussion forward. Thank you very much for allowing me to share my thoughts in this topic that's so close to my heart.
Thank you
Thank
so
you, ma'am.
Ma'am, please continue this abortion wala scene.
So Dr. Shinde, I'll cover it in one of the interactions that the students put in. But
Okay.
just to complete the thought, I was saying that the right of self-determination for the purpose of having access to safe abortion is a problem that women in European countries are still fighting. We think that developed countries which have more access to education, more access to resources, in those countries the position for dignity of women would be different. It's actually not so. And you will find it surprising that a country like Nepal has the right of access to safe abortion for a woman as part of the fundamental rights in the Nepalese constitution that they recently reframed completely for their country. So these battles do not they do not get defined by the levels of development that a country has gone to, the geography that they lie in, what is the kind of governance, whether it is democratic government, autocratic government, or communist government. These are issues that women face across the world to different degrees, and that is why it is important to continue this battle against all efforts to strangulate the dignity of women.
Thank you so much, Aishwarya ma'am. Can we move on to the question answer session? So, ma'am, recently in our college, we had a debate discussion where the topic of the debate was the status of women in India. And one of the most important questions, in my opinion, that kept coming up again and again was a differentiation between what is on paper and what is the ground reality. So the question here is, the lockdown period has witnessed an increase in rate of domestic violence, online harassment in workplace structure, and cybercrime against women. How can this rate decrease, or how can we tackle this issue?
Very important point that you have raised, Ria. I just glanced over it when I was sharing my thoughts, but no amount of robust constitutional principles and statutory laws and policy will make a difference if we as citizens are not ready to give wings to our daughters. That is where, to my mind, the real problem really lies. If you see, you are right, the pandemic time has been extremely excruciating for crimes against women in all ways. Domestic violence has been a huge red herring. It has been a huge problem in these times, and a lot of effort has gone in by governmental and non-governmental organizations to ensure that women have access, their voice can be heard. But the problem is that women and children, this is a common problem. Women and children, unfortunately for children, it ends when they become self-sufficient. But for women, our societal framework is such that they are considered as the vulnerable group in the family and vulnerable group in the society. In the name of having these, personal laws, we want to control our women. We want to continue to have complete control of their lives. Oh, your brother can do this, you can't do this. In the name of safety, we want to have complete control on their lives. Most of the cases, more than 50% of the cases of abuse against women, do you know where it happens? In the four walls of homes, in the four walls of those places which are supposed to be protectors for them. But when protectors turn predators, what happens? That is the biggest problem. And when I was saying that today that there is no male bastion, women are there in all walks of life, but only as individual cases of example. Women as a class, are we there really in the equal numbers that we should be? We are, after all, one half of the population, but we are not there in those male bastions as one half of the population. Why? Because all of us have not been given that freedom at home. If we are given the freedom at home to pursue what we really want to pursue, the confidence, if our wings are clipped at home, then how can we fly outside the home? That is where the problem happens. And we have amongst the best laws in the world. When we talk about women-specific laws, our laws do not lack. That is my impression. We lack hugely in law enforcement. We lack hugely in justice delivery mechanism. These are huge problems that need to be tackled institutionally. Efforts are being made to tackle them. More will need to be done. We also have our resource crunch as a developing world. But the real game changer, Justice RBG, the notorious RBG, the second woman judge of the US Supreme Court, who we lost 6 months back, the formidable, brave woman. When she was asked, when is it then that there will be real change for women's empowerment and equal representation of women, she had a one-liner response. She said, the real change will only happen when men start taking up the responsibility of raising the next generation as equal stakeholders, as equal partners. Our societal, strictures, barriers are created in such a manner that, have you ever heard, Ria, of a man being given a situation or an option that, oh, you have become a father, so either you give up your job or take care of your child? Why is this an option only given? Now, law does not give this option. This is an option that is a constraint that our society puts on us, our families put on us. You need not go to the school. Your brother needs to get educated. You are anyways going to get married. In our times, the things are changing, surely, but surely. In our times, my law school, when I attended law school, there were 4 or 5 girls in the class of 60, 70. Today, the classrooms are half girls and half boys. Because in our times, they used to tell us that लड़की से law पढ़वा रहे हो, इससे शादी कौन करेगा? ये तो कानून दिखाएगी. Not anymore. But, we became we pursued what we wanted to pursue. I'm sure, Dr. Shinde will agree with me. These journeys were possible because at home, we got a lot of latitude and liberty and independence and freedom to pursue what we wanted to pursue. That is where the change will really happen.
Yes, definitely.
Ma'am, that also gives birth to another very important question, in my opinion, is how can one at an individual level fight off the patriarchal and stereotypical mindset? Because a lot of times what happens is the answer to this question is you should move out. But financial resources aren't just available for everybody. So how can one go about it when the option of moving out is not there?
So I think it's important to understand that it is not a battle against men versus women. We are all battling, as men and women, we are all battling against that stereotypical mindset. And let me tell you again, in my experience, I have seen enough and more progressive men who have allowed complete latitude and freedom to women in their families, at their homes, as their colleagues, as your father, as your brother, as your sons, as your colleagues, friends. And there are enough and more number of women who become part of that patriarchal mindset once they come in a position of power, authority, and responsibility where they can make that change. So it is really a battle that we need to understand that it's a battle of the mindset. And yes, if you're facing problems at home, I mean, if you don't have that, though that issue is now changing a lot. I mean, we all realize that in this generation, we all have far more latitude and freedom. The next generations have far more latitude and freedom. And where they don't have, they take it upon themselves to make sure that, okay, it's going to be a slow process. You may not have, with the help and support, the process gets faster. But if you don't have the help and support, then you swim against the tide. Then you realize that you're swimming against the tide. It is going to take more time. It is going to take more effort. But you swim against the tide and realize what needs to be realized. Do what you really need to pursue. There are institutional mechanisms available, Ria, but it really depends on what kind of abuse or problems that the girls or women are facing at home. So those, you're right. I mean, that financial wherewithal is a serious constraint that actually becomes the stumbling block. But that is why it is important for all women to have economic independence.
Thank you, ma'am. So I would like to call upon Vandana from the audience. Vandana has put a question, ma'am, in the chat box that she says, why do women still need to outstand in their field to follow their career and their dreams? Vandana, if you would like to go ahead and ask this to ma'am yourself.
Thank you, Ria. Hello, ma'am. It's my pleasure. Am I audible, Ria?
Yes, you're audible. Please go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. It's my pleasure to be listening you here in this webinar. And as a woman, and I'm a feminist, so this is a question which always intrigue in my mind. Like, if I want to follow a career or a field, why I'm always expected from the society, though it is a patriarchal culture we are following, that I need to outstand. Like, we are in a progressive society right now where my parents or my family members are like very much progressive towards me. But I consider myself privileged that I'm allowed to study. I'm allowed to go and study to a place where, like, living all alone. But when I see the society, like my friends, my colleagues, there are many more like they're not allowed because they're not outstanding in their field. So when will it change and how to take stand for this? What can be your suggestion, ma'am?
It will change when we bring up our sons and daughters differently, Vandana ji. That is the only way the change will happen. There was an interesting question that was put to Sushma Swaraj ji, late Sushma Swaraj ji. I am a big fan of hers. What a magician with words she was. What a charismatic lady. It was always a privilege to hear her. So in one of the sessions that I was attending, somebody put her a question that, well, we have started going out and working and we are, earning, we are contributing economically to the family. But our husbands do not help at home. We still have to go out and earn and come back and make, the food is our responsibility, home housekeeping is our responsibility, child rearing is our responsibility, everything falls on our head. So Sushma ji very smiled and very interestingly she said, don't fight with your husbands too much. They have been brought up by mothers who did not allow sons to do too much. But you make sure that when you have a son, you allow and ask your son to help out at home, so that tomorrow when he has a life partner, he will not be out of place in helping out his life partner, and he will not feel that it's not my job. And Vannaji, the things are changing. It is a very slow process, but it is certainly a process that is happening. Initially, you're right, girls were allowed that liberty and latitude only if you were standing out, that, oh, if you are going to actually make a difference, then we will allow you to go out. Otherwise, you are better off just at home only. So, but with more and more women making their places felt, and, the society also having more and more examples, things are going to change more rapidly now. The first 100 years or first 50 years of change is always more difficult. It's like, it's a process that takes, but then a time comes when the change becomes so remarkable that it explodes like a chain reaction without any more catalysts required from outside. Let me give you one example of Rajasthan judiciary. In Rajasthan, when I became a senior, I realized that I was the first woman to be designated from Rajasthan as a senior, and my state had never even leave alone designation of a woman lawyer as a senior. There was no woman from the bar who had been elevated to the judgeship also. No woman on the Rajasthan High Court has been elevated from a woman lawyer for last 74 years. That's such a sad statistic. But Vannaji, if you see for the last 20 years, 15 years actually, last 15 years, the recruitments that are happening in lower judiciary, district judiciary, the lower higher judiciary, initially there was some reservation provided to women. I mean, reservation is still there, but that reservation is only to a limited extent. And that is, women's reservation is, it's not considered as a horizontal reservation. It's considered as a vertical reservation in their own categories. But total does not go beyond 30%. But for the last 15 years, in a state like Rajasthan, which has not had women, in judiciary or in litigation as formidable figures, over 70% women who are candidates who are getting selected are women in the judiciary. Now, when these young girls, when they get trained as judicial minds, when they move up the ladder, you can't paratroop women from on top. You can't have, you can't make women sit on the topmost layers of any institution. You have to have them, induct them at the grassroots level as foot soldiers, train them, have them, so that they have the experience and the training to rise to the top. And that that change is happening so rapidly that the next 50 years are going to be incredible years for our country. I can definitely say, Vannaji.
Thank you, ma'am. This answer is like, I agree with you. Like, this is a slow process, and I am going to be a part of it for very sure. Like, I am a law student right now, so I'm going to be. And there's one more question, ma'am. If it is like, I'm always asked a question like, what about the gender neutral law? Like, crime rate against women are increasing. I agree with it. But what about the crime rates about the men? Like, they don't come up with it usually. But still there are various cases we heard about, like men are raped, and like they even suffer through, like till a age of till 18 we consider them under juvenile justice. But what after that? Why we are that?
So thank you for your question again, Vannaji. Very interesting question. You have taken us to the different paradigm completely. You're right. There are gender specific laws which are there. And let me tell you, rape is a gender specific law across the world. It's not just in our country that rape is an offense only against women. But yes, POCSO is a law that allows prosecution for sexual harassment and sexual relationship or rape, etc., for children below 18. So POCSO is a gender neutral law, and it allows room for gender neutrality for victims of sexual abuse below 18. But Vandana ji, these are steps that the society has to take naturally. I mean, on your first question was that why women need to stand out, and your second question is that why that these offenses that are against women, why should they not be gender neutral? Well, ultimately they have to become gender neutral. I would love it when the society does not give the tag of vulnerability to women, when women are equal stakeholders, not just in professional lives and in all walks of life. See, we can't wish away crime, so crime will continue to happen. But if we will have more perpetrators who are women as criminals, then maybe these laws will change. Or we will today see the problem today is still dowry death is not a death that you have you ever heard a son-in-law dying of unusual circumstances or suspicious circumstances in a matrimonial, in a in-laws home where there is no access to the girl, to his family? I've not heard of a single instance. Of course, sexual abuse is now, it is there. And slowly the laws must change. The Sexual Harassment Act today only allows women to be victims, to be treated as victims in that law. But these are power plays. So slowly times will change. And as more and more women become, I would love to see complete gender neutrality of all laws. But I think it's going to take a long time for us to reach there, where all perpetrators and accused persons and masterminds of crimes are women in equal numbers. And then it becomes just a criminal versus a non-criminal, and it's not about gender anymore. But I don't see this happening in near future.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you, Vandana, for your questions. Moving on to Shubham Sharma. Ma'am, his question is, what is your take on the relevance to women empowerment to jurisprudence of feminism in today's era? Shubham, if you're present with us, please unmute yourself.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ria. Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, I would like to know that what is the relevance of women empowerment to the jurisprudence, the base of feminism, and the implementation and its interpretation in today's era? Like, what is your take on this, ma'am?
So I think feminism is more like a activist word that became the basis for realizing equal protection of life, of rights for women, equal dignity and equal justice for women. Essentially, some forms of activism are important when social structures have to be changed. It would not have been possible to have the 19th Constitution Amendment in the US Constitution that I was speaking about without the persistent, continuous efforts of brave women who were known as suffragettes, because they were marching for suffrage, adult suffrage for women. So these coming closer to home, Nirbhaya amendments, I mean the criminal law amendments, which are known as Nirbhaya amendments because they were a result of the tsunami of activism that happened in our country after the Nirbhaya. And I mean the society stood up, and we all had candles in our hands, and we were all saying that enough is enough, this is not done. Before that, mind you, Shubham, the laws in IPC only covered 2 offenses. So there were only 2 offenses against women. One was outraging the modesty of women, and one was the rape offenses, different degrees of sections, but rape and outraging the modesty, that's all. But after the Nirbhaya movement, not just the definition of rape itself got expanded to cover all actions of abuse, of grievous abuse, but it also allowed for changes in the law to include offenses like stalking, eve teasing, voyeurism, acid throwing, earlier these offenses were considered as innocuous. It's okay. They would come in hurt. So acid throwing would come in hurt. But acid throwing is an offense. Essentially, this is done by jilted lovers. And these acid throwing, it leaves these women with such a kind of physical, mental, emotional trauma. The expenses that are required for recreating the skin, face, etc. Huge judgments, line and length of judgments have gone into this. I mean, Lakshmi, etc. These judgments have gone into how the acid should be taken away from over-the-counter sale, and how there has to be relief and rehabilitation for acid attack victims, destigmatizing the acid attack victims, destigmatizing the victims of rape. Earlier, rape victims, this Vishakha judgment that came out of a crime that happened again in my state. There was a Sathin, today's Asha worker, you may equate them with. So these are women who are in the rural areas, and they are responsible for making sure that proper execution of governmental policies and laws happens. So this Sathin, she had stopped. What she had done, why she was gang raped, was because she had stopped the child marriage of in some influential family in the village, because it was against the law. So that high class family, that seemingly high caste family, wanted to take revenge, and the men of that family gang raped this Sathin because she had to be taught a lesson. And when she went to the police station to lodge FIR, women wear this long flowing skirt, same as Gujarat, if you are familiar with the topography of Gujarat. Ghagras or lehengas, that's what they wear in the rural settings. And when she went to report the crime, her lehenga was kept there in the thana that as a police, as a case property, because it had. So they did not even have the sensitivity to tell her, to ask her if she had any clothes. She actually had to take the turban of her husband, tie it around herself, and walk back to the village. Yogita, can you please mute yourself? So feminism, maybe feminism is a loose word, but these movements are extremely important, and that outraged the country so much, even there, that it led to this PIL, where Vishakha guidelines were framed, that if women are going to be punished in this manner for doing the job that they are employed to do, then what is the point? I mean, you can't have women in the workplace if they can't be protected from this kind of abuse in the workplace. So these movements are extremely important. These movements become fulcrums of that social change. Law responds to the society. See, if we want a particular law, it has to be brought in. The legislator will bring it, but in a democracy, it is extremely important for the people's movement to really speak about and reflect what changes we want in the laws.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Ma'am, can I ask a question?
I'm sorry, Prabal, please wait your turn. We have people who are putting in messages in the chat box. So if you'd like to ask a question, please write it in the chat box.
Okay,
Now,
fine.
on Saundarya Patil. Ma'am, her question is, how can we bridge the wide gap between the goals enunciated in the Constitution, plans, policies, etc., and situational reality of status of women in India? Saundarya, if you can unmute.
I think we've already covered this part, Ria, of the changes on the ground and the changes in the Constitution and the principles and all. I already mentioned we have amongst the best laws. Just to recap, but we need more effort on the law enforcement front, on the justice delivery front, and the biggest change at homes.
I think that's a very common question, ma'am, usually, because a lot of times what happens is that when things happen to somebody in reality, the first thing they look for is, there's a law in place. How did it happen? And then you end up criticizing the law. But somewhere down the line, we've got to always work with it.
Ria, we have to remind ourselves that murder has been an offense since the time immemorial in our modern world. even before the modern legal practices were put in place. Has that stopped murders? Society, it's that then there, if you go there, then you look at the good versus evil debate, because evil somehow, I mean, that's a sociological debate, that is a anthropological debate, that why human beings commit crimes. But the good and evil goes on hand in hand. I think we have to have mechanisms in place to dissuade those evils and to reward the goods in the society.
Ma'am, another question we have is the right of human officers of Indian Air Force, Indian Navy, and Indian Army. What considerable changes have taken place in the overall structure, taken into account the landmark verdict of 17th February 2020, that is the Permanent Commission? So, what are the changes that have been taken place?
Now women can, so army, this is a slightly a long answer I'll have to give, but army had, I'll try to be brief. Army did not allow permanent commission to women. Women were taken in the 1991-92. Initially they were taken in as an experimental basis for 5 years, and they felt that if the experiment works, then we will extend it. The experiment worked. Women proved themselves to be efficient soldiers in service of the nation, as women have proved themselves in other fields. So what they did was they extended it by 5 years. The experiment worked beyond that also, so they extended it again. So the extensions kept on happening, but they were not considering women as permanent commission. So short service commission allowed women to serve for a maximum of 14-15 years, depending on whether it's Army, Air Force, or Navy. And then you have to go. Then if you go at 14 years, if you have joined the service around 25, you are still you're still at the in very productive years of your work life. So you are left in the lurch from your productive work life. Also, you are not entitled to the benefits of the service that you have put in the form of pensionary benefits, etc. So, and then there were other benefits that were not available to women, because they were not, their promotions were not at par with their merit, because they were treated only as short service commissioned officers. They were not taken in for command roles on this, that, or other UN commissions, etc. So this problem really was brought in for the change that really happened after the Supreme Court judgment is that now this entire problem, the mantle that was there of short service commission officers only for women, has changed. Now women can be short service commission officers or permanent commission officers. The choice is there. And it is not their gender that is going to be the deciding factor on whether they command their unit or command their posts, etc. It will be the merit and merit alone, like it is for gentlemen officers. So they will be decided on the basis of their merit, on what posts and what designations they can hold, and gender is not a disqualification anymore. So that it really opens your, in any case, Ria, now, this was a battle that had been going on in the courts since 2005. But today the defense forces have opened up to women even in combat roles. So women are playing very significant roles in the combat operations of the Indian Defense Forces, and they're doing a formidable job of it. So the laws have, opened ways and allowed them a free access to their rights. But let me tell you, it was their own hard work and their own courage under fire, because of which that experiment, otherwise, no court if defense would have said that, no, this experiment has not worked, we can't allow the national security to be compromised by allowing this experiment to go on, it would not have gone today. So it is extremely important for us to understand that it's not the courts that have allowed this this great watershed to happen in the defense forces. It is the caliber and the courage of those extremely brave women officers themselves, who shone under fire, who were awarded gallantry awards. I have been privileged to represent some of those women officers, and I feel inspired by their journeys, and I feel that it was a honor for me to be representing them. A role of lawyers is also like playing actors and actresses. So when we are representing clients, you actually, you try to stand in your client's shoes, and you feel that power and you feel that strength. And it's incredible to be representing those courageous women officers. But it's them and them alone who has allowed this change to happen for themselves.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your insight. So if we can have one last question for the day. So can I have Prabal? Would you like to ask?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ria. Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, in India, we talk about protection of right of women. But ma'am, I genuinely want to know, when we talk about marriages, in every religion, something different things are written. But ma'am, if bigamy is not allowed in one religion, for example, I think under Section 17 of Hindu Marriage Act and IPC 494 and 495, which we have also seen in Narasu Appamali case, I think of 1951. So how can these problems can be solved? Because due to this, women are getting affected a lot. And ma'am, what is the solution of it if we are excluding UCC, as the Law Commission just told that we don't need UCC right now?
Prabal, you have raised an issue which is a complete topic in itself, but let me try and touch it briefly. I feel that UCC itself is a misnomer today, because we actually have, we have to understand it conceptually. See, civil rights are civil relationships, are relationships that we have not just with our wife and our child. Civil relationships are also relationships that we have with our employer, employee, how we make our home, how we pay our taxes, how we get electricity, how we walk on the road, how we pay insurance, etc. Have you seen personal laws governing them? No, no. Nobody objected. Let me give you one more example of child women specific laws. Adoption has been a personal law practice. Adoption is not something that was a criminal right or other civil right. That is a civil right with a child you are having. Now, adoption was permissible only under Hindu law, because Hindu law had that belief that you can't get moksha unless you are given last rites ceremonies are done by the son. So many times adoption used to happen at the time of death of the Hindu male, etc. But what was happening for other religions? There was a Guardianship and Wards Act of 1890, I think, that allowed you to have a child as a ward, and you could be the guardian of that, but there was no adoption allowed. Juvenile Justice Act came, Supreme Court judgments came, CARA guidelines came, and quietly adoption became a gender neutral and religion neutral personal law practice. Did you hear any hue and cry about that? No. You hear hue and cry only about personal law practices by which you can keep curtailment on the women and children of your family. And it is unfortunate that these so-called, I don't even like to call them religious gurus. They are really contractors of religion who, in the name of religious practices, want to oppose this tooth and nail. I think, Supreme Court has said it enough number of times, right from Shah Bano onwards. Every decade, at least once or twice, the Supreme Court has said Article 44 is there, Uniform Civil Code needs to be done. Uniform Civil Code is already there. It's only marriage, succession, and divorce that is not uniform. And I think we need to call the bluff now. We need to call the bluff. Okay, all right. If everybody wants to keep their personal laws, keep personal laws, but make it gender neutral. Let it be religion specific, but make it gender neutral. So every right that a Hindu male has, let a Hindu woman have that. Every right a Muslim man has, let the Muslim woman have that. I think that will call the bluff. I don't know. It's really, I feel sad that, we still are, we are so progressive in our mindset and thought we want to take India in the next century, but we still don't want to allow the women to break free from these shackles of personal law practices. But if this is not good vote bank politics, so that's why it has not happened for 75 years. The legislation has done nothing about it, despite it being there. But slowly and surely, one at a time, these practices will be knocked out. You know that the whole review petition of Sabrimala that is pending, there are several issues that have been raised in those consolidated petitions. One of those is the issue of polygamy. There are other issues which are restrictive practices and other personal law practice, areas with regard to women's rights. There is female genital mutilation. There is, ostracizing women if they marry outside the community in another religion. So these practices are all there. Now it is pending for a larger constitution bench. I think if the legislature does not rise up to the occasion, the courts of the country will.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for answering all of the questions. And thank you so much for everybody who asked a question in the comments as well. Now, moving on to the next segment of the event, that is the vote of thanks. I would like to call upon Harsha to deliver the same. Harsha, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Ria. Good evening, everyone. I am Harsha Jaiswal, BLLB second year student from DY Patil Law College, Pimpri, Pune. It's my pleasure to give vote of thanks today. I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude towards today's speaker, Ms. Aishwarya Bhati ma'am, Additional Solicitor General of India, for her vibrant speech and sharing her valuable thoughts with us on the topic Contribution of Indian Constitution in Women Empowerment. This topic is extremely relevant in today's world, and being a law student, it was our privilege to know the views of such a great lawyer on the topic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, such an event cannot happen overnight. Wheels start rolling around a week ago. It requires planning and a bird's eye view for details. We have been fortunate enough to be supported by a team of very motivated and dedicated teachers and my colleagues from DY Patil Law College and Think India organization. I am grateful to Dr. DY Patil Unitech Society for giving constant support in all the activities we conduct in college. I would like to thank respected Dr. Ujjwala Shinde ma'am, our beloved principal of Dr. DY Patil Law College, for her relentless support and guidance. I would also like to thank all the other coordinators of Think India organization for working so hard to make this event possible. Lastly, I would thank each one of our participants for joining us today and making today's event so lively and interactive. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Ma'am, we want you physically.
After the pandemic subsides, I'll be happy to come, ma'am, anytime.
Yes. Thank you so much.
But we'll make it only interactive that time.
Yes, definitely.
Only question answer.
Yes.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you.